Well, if you're hungry, it's often because your blood sugar levels aren't stable enough yet. And that's because it's too quick to when you've been eating refined carbohydrates and all the rest of it. Eventually, your blood sugars are going to get stable. Or even if you skip a meal, it's not going to be a problem. And going to the gym and working out before you eat actually may have an advantage. Some people believe that exercising after a 12-hour fast preferentially mobilizes fat.
Welcome back to another episode of the Peak Performance Life podcast. Today, I am super excited to have Dr. Alan Goldhamer on the line with us. He is the founder of TrueNorth Health Center, which he founded over 40 years ago, a state-of-the-art facility that provides medical and chiropractic services, psychotherapy and counseling, as well as massage and body work, and much, much more than that. He is one of the most pioneering and dedicated visionaries in health today. He's an outspoken professional who doesn't shy away from a spirited debate. He's deeply committed to helping people stuck in self-destructive cycles reclaim their ability to change their lives. Dr. Goldhamer has supervised the fasts. That's one thing we'll talk about here. Different fasting protocols, medically supervised fasts, intermittent fasts. We'll talk about the difference between all of those. He is one of the foremost experts in this topic. Under his guidance, the center has become one of the premier training facilities for doctors wishing to gain certification in the supervision of therapeutic fasting. Dr. Goldhamer, thank you so much for joining us here today.
My pleasure. I'm glad to be here.
Well, great. Let's start with a brief background. How did you come to start this facility that you have helped so many people over the years?
Yeah, my interest in fasting goes way back. I was about 16 years old and I was a frustrated basketball player. My best friend used to beat me terribly, and I thought if I got healthier, I might be able to get an edge on him. So I started reading books, and I came across a guy named Herbert Shelton who said that health had causes just like disease had causes. That if you wanted to be healthy, you had to do the things that caused that. And he said that that involved diet, sleep, exercise, and he also talked about fasting as a way of kind of speeding up the detoxification process that came when people made bad choices. And so I adopted these principles. Unfortunately, it failed miserably because my friend adopted the same dietary and lifestyle habits, and here we are, I'm 65 now. He still beats me every time we play. So I was not successful at learning how to beat him in basketball, but it did get me very interested in this idea of healthcare. I was also inspired by my uncle, who was a medical doctor, and when I was 16, I told him that I wanted to get into this alternative medicine business. And he said, absolutely not, that nobody in our family would go to a doctor like that, let alone become a doctor like that. He said it would be better if I should become a communist spy. He thought that was about the worst thing. My father, on the other hand, took me aside after he saw his brother yelling at me. And he said, son, I don't know anything about this alternative medicine business. He says, but anything that makes him that mad and angry, it can't be bad. So you stick to your guns. And ultimately I did. And, we've been working with this and researching this, as you said, for 40 years. We've had 25,000 people undergo fasting at the TrueNorth Health Center. And we've realized that Shelton had a really good point, which was if you want to get people healthy, you have to do the things that cause health. And the important thing there is getting rid of the things that cause disease. And in our society today, it's dietary excess that's the dominant factor in much of the premature death and disability that you see around you. High blood pressure, diabetes, autoimmune disease, many forms of cancer are all contributed to by the inflammation that comes from the visceral fat that comes from gaining too much weight. Visceral fat is like a tumor. If you think about it, it's hypertrophic, it's hypermetabolic, it's hyperplastic. It gives off inflammatory products that cause these different diseases. These different diseases are treated as if they're completely independent. You have to go to different doctors just to be diagnosed with these conditions, but they all have this inflammation behind them as a cause. And so it's not that complicated. People eat too much, and we can talk about why they do that. They gain fat. About 10% of that fat's visceral fat, the fat that accumulates around the organs in the belly. That fat gives off inflammation. People get sick with a variety of different diseases that all have a common cause. And it turns out we've figured out a way to get rid of the visceral fat with fasting. Fasting, as it turns out, preferentially mobilizes that visceral fat disproportionately to the other tissues. And so that's why we're able to treat this seemingly different variety of conditions with a very similar approach and get very consistent, reproducible results. And we've been publishing in the scientific literature showing that if you're willing to do this, you can get predictable and reliable results.
That sounds amazing. What can you share? What are some of the results that you've seen? What are some of the different, most common people that come to you that you have maybe seen dramatic results with, or some of the published literature?
Sure. Well, the leading contributing cause of death and disability in the United States is high blood pressure and the things associated with high blood pressure, the strokes, the heart attacks, et cetera. Our very first study that was published in the peer-reviewed literature was a retrospective analysis of 174 consecutive patients with high blood pressure. And of those 174 people, 174 people were able to normalize their blood pressure enough to eliminate the need for medication. And we have the largest effect size in treating stage 3 hypertension that's ever been published to this date in human beings with high blood pressure. In fact, if you look at people who start with 180 or higher systolic blood pressure, the average drop was over 60 points. So in those 60 points, I understand most of these people, these were all medicated to begin with. They're all unmedicated at the end. So it's 60 points plus whatever effect their medication may have been having. Essentially, everybody with essential hypertension that's willing to do this is able to achieve normal blood pressure. The catch is they have to keep willing to eat a healthy diet and go to bed on time and exercise in order to sustain it. Because you're not curing it, you're managing it. It's just like obesity. If people go on a long-term fast, they're going to lose a pound a day. And if they are able to stay on a healthy diet afterwards, they maintain that weight loss. And we've shown that people can, in fact, do that. The challenge, though, is that it's difficult in a world designed to make you fat, sick, and miserable to make the choices that it takes to get healthy and stay healthy, because it involves diet, involves sleep, involves exercise.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And these are topics very near and dear to my heart as well. My father, who was a very healthy 78-year-old just 5 years ago, had high blood pressure, never wanted to go to doctors, never wanted to get it fixed, never changed any of his habits. And eventually some sort of event happened in his life, which triggered something in him. And he ended up having multiple strokes. And ever since then, his dementia has been getting worse and worse every year. And he's in a much worse place now where, you know, this is something I feel like he could have been more proactive about. And it's something not a lot of people talk about. In fact, you know, I've done 160 podcast episodes now, and, you know, blood pressures, yes, it's come up a few times, but no one really talks about, okay, here's a way to actually lower your blood pressure without medication. So I think that's really phenomenal.
Well, it's important to understand the medications have some very serious limitations. First of all, people don't like taking the medications, and only 50% adherence to medication protocols because they don't like the chronic cough, the fatigue, the impotence, and also the reality is premature death. Because although blood pressure medications will lower your blood pressure, they do not reduce your risk of heart attack. They may reduce your risk of stroke for people with the highest levels of hypertension. The reason why they don't give everybody hypertensive medications, even though over 60% of people over 60 have high blood pressure, is because more people will die from the high blood pressure medications than they will from the high blood pressure unless you wait until people's systolic blood pressure rises to a fairly high level. Because of the side effects of medication, including death, you just don't give it to everybody. You wait until the risk of stroke is so high that the benefit you get at reducing your stroke offsets the increased risk of dying from the medications themselves.
Wow. Yeah, that's fascinating. Let's talk about fasting then. Let's talk about the different types of fasting. Now, our listeners have heard about intermittent fasting. And it's actually very interesting as I interview a lot of guests, I kind of hear different trends. And it was like a couple of years ago, it was like intermittent fasting was the big craze and everyone was doing it. And now it's like, oh, wait a minute. No, intermittent fasting has now, a lot of people are saying now, oh, well, it's hard to hit your protein intake, and protein and keeping your muscles as you get older is the most important thing. And so you hear a lot of different things. And then, so we've heard about intermittent fasting. I've also have a friend who's he had some really bad psoriasis, and he did, I believe it was a 21-day water-only fast. He did have virtually medical people supervising him and things like that. But I just couldn't believe it. I'm like, wow, 21 days without eating. It's almost unimaginable for most people, including myself as well.
We fast people routinely up to 40 days. So we don't do longer than that. But we just published a paper actually in one of the journals on plaque psoriasis. And in fact, it was actually only a 2-week fast in this particular patient, but dramatic changes. There's some very graphic photographic evidence that shows that, by the way, any of the stuff we're talking about, all of our research is available. It's freely accessible on our website at healthpromoting.com. People can go on and see these articles, look it up themselves and see. It's pretty remarkable, particularly in plaque psoriasis, that, this patient in our study had it for 21 years. So it wasn't just a recent onset. And got dramatic resolution in a couple of weeks of fasting and was able to sustain it with a whole plant food SOS-free diet. So, these conditions can reverse, even though your doctor may tell you diet doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you eat. There's no getting well. I mean, when you think about, say, high blood pressure, if you go to any doctor and they'll tell you, take these drugs, here's how to do it. And they will promise you, if you do exactly what you're told, you'll never get well. They will tell you, you'll be on these drugs the rest of your life because you'll never recover. You will be sick the rest of your life. And yes, there are side effects, but that's the price you pay to slightly reduce your risk of stroke.
Yeah. So your website there is healthpromoting.com. Highly recommend people check out healthpromoting.com. Check out all his studies and different resources that he has there as well. So I'm curious, I do want to talk about, obviously, extended medically supervised fast. Again, most people, to hear 40 days without eating is just like mind-blowing for most people. And most people can't even probably wrap their head about how it's possible. But if you're in pain and you're feeling worse than you ever had, and this is your only option, you'll do whatever it takes, right? We always say a healthy person has 1,000 wishes, but a sick person has only one.
People think if you get on a plane in New York and you were to fly all the way to California, you'd die over Colorado from starvation if you didn't eat the pretzels. They think those pretzels saved their life. But the reality is the hardest part of fasting is really just the first couple of days. Because once you go into ketosis, your brain changes from burning glucose to burning beta-hydroxybutyric acid. Essentially, that's what fasting is just a changeover in the fuel. If you couldn't do that, if a human being couldn't do that, a human would only last about a week without eating because you would go into gluconeogenesis, enter starvation, break down your proteins, and you die. Because humans have such large brains, we had to have the ability to switch to an alternative fuel in order to survive more than a week, which is necessary because sometimes spring comes late. And all the humans that couldn't fast, that has changed their brain fuel over, they died. We know that because, the 8 billion people on the planet today, every one of them, you take food away, after a couple of days, they burn up their glycogen stores, they enter into burning ketones, and specifically beta-hydroxybutyric acid becomes 2/3 of the fuel that the brain is burning. And now you can go, you and I, we could fast 70 days. Not that you should, I wouldn't recommend that, but you could go 70 days before you enter into starvation. In other words, fasting is when you still have labile reserves. Starvation is when you've depleted your labile reserves, you'll start breaking down vital tissues. One of the keys to long-term success in fasting is rest. And it's counterintuitive because people say, well, if I exercise when I fast, I lose more weight. And you do, but you're not losing more fat. You're not losing more fat, you're losing more muscle. Because when you exercise in fasting, you're forcing gluconeogenesis. You break down muscle for sugar to maintain the muscle and the brain needs. If you rest when you're fasting, you preferentially burn fat. For example, we did a study. We took patients and used a DEXA scanner with sophisticated software that allows you to do detailed body composition analysis. And what we found was a person that fasts typically for, say, a couple of weeks would lose about 10% of their total body weight, but they'd lose 20% of their total fat tissue, and shockingly, 40% of all their visceral fat. They'd only lose 6% of lean tissue, and that 6% of lean tissue is fully replenished and then some by 6 weeks of follow-up. So after 6 weeks post-fasting, they actually had a higher percentage of their body lean tissue than they did at baseline. But what continued to come off was the fat. It's fat that's preferentially mobilized in rest. Now, some people will say, well, they did a fast and they lost some lean tissue. Yeah, because they're exercising and they're active. And so that's kind of, unfortunately, one of the side effects of trying to minimize muscle loss is to actually minimize muscle use during the fasting process.
Very interesting. My friend did tell me that as well, that he was resting a lot. I think he was having a hard time being very active anyway in 20 days into a fast as well, but makes sense. Kind of fun question real quick. What is the longest water-only fast that you have heard of or maybe witnessed or maybe have heard of?
Oh, the gentleman I trained with, Alec Burton in Sydney, Australia, I trained there 40 years ago. He was the person at the time that had the most experience in the world doing long-term water-only fasting. He used to routinely fast people in the 60 days, and he had one gentleman who went to 103 days on water only.
Wow.
And I asked him, when I got there, he was no longer doing fasting over 40 days. He said he would only do the short fast, the up to 40 days, what he called short fast, And I said, well, Dr. Burton, why is it that we're not doing the long-term fasting anymore? And he said, oh, because of sleep deprivation. And I said, oh, do they have trouble sleeping after 40 days? He goes, not the patients, me. Because when you do longer-term fasting, it's a much more delicate situation in terms of monitoring electrolyte balance and whatnot. And so by keeping the fast shorter, you don't run into the hydration problems as much. You don't have as much, complications that can come up. And so what he would do is he'd fast people for 40 days, he'd re-aliment them, and then if necessary, they'd do another fast. If it took longer to break down a tumor or there was some problem that was taking more than that 40 days. Fortunately, I found most of the people that we treat don't need 40-day fasting. Most of them, it's 2 to 3 weeks of fasting. Sometimes it's as little as 5 to 10 days. So the idea is fast as short as possible, but long enough to get the problem solved. So if you have high blood pressure, everybody doesn't have to fast for 40 days. Some people, a week or two is plenty in order to normalize it. And then they still have to do the healthy diet and lifestyle to sustain the results.
Yeah.
I'd like to mention, though, we did a study recently, a prospective study with our colleagues from the Mayo Clinic treating high blood pressure. We had enrolled 29 subjects with hypertension, and 28 of those people had entirely normal pressure without medication at the end of fasting, and one required half their dose of medication at 6-week follow-up. But then we followed those people for a year because we wanted to know what percentage of them would maintain their weight loss and maintain their normal blood pressure drug-free at 1 year. And it turned out 75% of the people in the follow-up had maintained normal blood pressure, normal weight with no medication, which was much higher than I would have anticipated. Because the reality is that it's very difficult to show studies with long-term outcomes with behavioral change because most of those studies fail. For example, if you're an alcoholic and you go to an inpatient program and spend $40,000 and go to 90 visits in 90 days to a 12-step program and you have family support, the chance that you'll be drinking again within a year is over 90%. It's over 90%. If you're a heroin addict and you go to state-mandated inpatient treatment program and you're, threat of jail, 90% failure rate. But I want you to think about this. The odds of a patient losing 5% of their body weight and keeping it off for a year under available medical approaches has a 95% failure rate. It's actually less likely for a doctor to cure obesity than they are to cure heroin addiction. And if your BMI is over 40, so you're in the 100-pound overweight range, the chance of ever losing that weight and keeping it off, the chance of is 0.01%. That means 99.99% failure rate. And the reason for that is, at least with alcoholics, we tell them the truth. We tell them they can't drink at all. We don't tell alcoholics, well, you can drink beer and wine or just drink on the weekends or put your alcohol in a smaller cup. Drink your alcohol with a spoon. Put the spoon down between each slurp and you won't be a drunk anymore. We tell them the truth. You're sensitive to these chemicals. Some people might be able to have a drink and not become a drunk, but it's not you. So you have to not drink at all. It's a big problem. It's radical. It's extreme, but that's what works. What do we tell overweight people? Eat less. Yeah, that works really well. Or change the color of your meat from red to white. Put your food on a smaller plate. Put your fork down between each, and you won't be overweight anymore. Or better yet, we say, oh, it's not nice to tell people they're overweight. That's blaming the victim. Let's pretend that it doesn't matter. And so that's exactly what happened during the pandemic of COVID-19. You have people dying right and left. The big risk factors for death were age and obesity. And yet we weren't allowed to talk about people being overweight and having visceral fat producing inflammation, suppressing their immune response as being a major risk factor of death and disability. And in fact, instead of encouraging people to lose their fat, what we did is we did just the opposite. Everybody gained significant weight. And so it's not politically correct to acknowledge that visceral fat acts like a tumor and that it's important for us to come up with a strategy to lose weight. And the reality is the conventional approaches are telling people to eat the same hyper-processed foods that fool their satiety mechanisms in their brain, just like alcohol, heroin, methamphetamines do, and thinking that somehow we're going to keep doing that and lose weight. Now think about this. If you're an alcoholic and you treat alcoholism with beer and wine, there's a 99.99% failure rate. And if you treat obesity with hyperprocessed foods like salt, oil, and sugar, there's a 99.99% failure rate.
Yeah.
So not surprising. The problem is the chemicals that fool our satiety mechanisms in our brain are salt, oil, and sugar. Salt, oil, and sugar are not food. They're hyperconcentrated food byproducts put back into food to make food taste better. That's what tasting better means. It means that those chemicals stimulate more dopamine production in our brain. It works with alcohol. It works with amphetamines. It works with salt, oil, and sugar. In fact, all these white powders, you got to watch out for them. It just seems like any white powder is suspicious. So the point is, if you get rid of the salt, oil, and sugar, what's left? Not much, because 93% of the calories consumed by people in industrialized country are either animal foods, so meat, fish, eggs, and dairy products, or hyper-processed, hyper-concentrated foods like salt, oil, sugar. And so the bottom line is that most people aren't eating whole foods anymore.
Right.
We used to eat whole foods. For 200,000 years, we ate mostly whole foods. For the last 200 years, though, we've been progressively increasing the amount of hyper-concentrated refined foods and sugars in the diet. And as a consequence, now, if you take away the meat, fish, eggs, dairy products, oil, salt, and sugar, there's not much left for people. Vegetables are, the parsley on the plate the person doesn't eat. It's the ketchup on your kid's school lunch program. We're not actually consuming large quantities of whole foods anymore.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about what is, so for example, when someone finishes a fast, and I believe I saw that you put people on like a plant-based diet. I believe you yourself have been plant-based for many years as well.
Since I was
is that right?
16, so that's 49 years so far.
Wow. Vegan for 49 years?
Vegan, whole plant food, SOS free.
Amazing. And so like when people finish the fast, it's interesting because a lot of people, I love hearing different perspective. We've had carnivore people on this podcast. We had keto people. We have, sure. I guess you're doing ketosis in a different way by fasting, right?
Yes.
That's the true ketosis, I guess. But
the thing is, you represent these different viewpoints, and they all have different benefits, and they have different advantages. But some of them have short-term advantages. On those things that are good for short-term weight loss or good for short-term muscle gain. And some were more focused on long-term. Like, for example, my focus in practice isn't necessarily getting the person the biggest, the quickest, or necessarily even losing weight the fastest. What the goal is that the last 20 years of their life are the best 20 years of their life, rather than finding themselves unable to talk or move, lying in some nursing home bed after they stroked out from having an unnecessary cardiac event. We want them to live until they die. So they want to live fully functional, go to bed one night and not wake up and not be debilitated waiting for their kids to change their diapers for the last 20 years of their life. And so what you do for long-term gain isn't necessarily the same thing you might do, say, for short-term athletic performance. If you want to play lineman in the NFL, you want to be as big as possible. And so most of them will use anabolic steroids, which work fabulously. They get really big and gain a lot of mass. The problem is they get testicular atrophy and they die in their 50s from heart attack, strokes and whatever. So not a good long-term health strategy, but definitely you'll get bigger faster than you would eating a healthy diet. So we got to be really careful. Same thing with weight loss. You want to lose 40 pounds overnight, just cut your leg off at the hip. I mean, that's the fastest way, but that's not necessarily a good long-term health strategy. So again, our focus, not the quickest, but maybe most consistent with the literature suggestion. But if you want to live a long and healthy life, you want to minimize animal food, maximize whole plant foods. And what we all agree on is get rid of the sugars and refined carbohydrates. The hyper-processed, highly foods are, I don't think, on anybody's recommendation list.
That's the common theme. That's the common theme across all is the processed foods, the added sugars, the processed carbs, those ones. Doesn't matter who you are, and that's why, some people, when they do vegan, even myself years ago, I did vegan, but I was like going to Subway and buying a foot-long sandwich with some lettuce and tomato in it. And I was really just eating a foot-long thing of bread, which was probably sprayed with pesticides and processed. And I felt awful. And then I say, yeah, vegan doesn't work for me. Well, yeah, there's a right way and a wrong
Well,
way to do it, right?
vegan just means no animal food. So Coca-Cola is vegan. It doesn't mean Coca-Cola is healthy.
Right.
French fries can be made without animal grease, but that doesn't make them healthy. Oreo cookies are vegan. It doesn't mean you're going to go on an Oreo cookie, Coke, and French fry diet. In fact, most vegans are not vegans to be healthy. They're vegan because of moral, ethical, and spiritual reasons. They want to save the planet because they realize animal husbandry is more responsible for global warming than the internal combustion engine. They want to save the animals because they don't think it's nice to take sentient creatures and torture them all their life and then kill them and eat them. They're not doing it for health reasons. I get in tremendous trouble at these vegan conferences when I speak because I point out that, meat has some problems, particularly commercially raised animal products have potential problems. But as bad as they are, some of this processed vegan material is even worse. They'd be better off eating meat. When you say that to religious zealot vegans, they get really upset with you because
Right.
they don't think anything's worse than eating meat because of the moral, ethical, and spiritual. But from a health standpoint, I'd rather have a person eating a lot of plant foods with a small amount of animal food than I would eating large amounts of refined carbohydrates.
Right.
So,
Right.
and listen, I'm a hardcore plant eater myself. So I have strong, beliefs about that. But we're not going to deny the fact there are some things even worse in terms of your health than the animal products that, some people may include in their diet.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me ask you real quick. I do want to get back into fasting, the topic of fasting, but curious since we're on this topic about what do you eat in a day? How many meals are you eating and what does a typical kind of meal look like for you?
Well, we advocate 16 hours a day of fasting and 8 hours a day of feeding, unless you're trying to gain weight. And then we do a 12-hour program. So, and we've done this for 40 years. So we basically, the rule is very simple. Don't eat 3 to 4 hours before you go to bed at night. So go to bed at a reasonable hour. Don't eat 3 to 4 hours before that. Now, if you're trying to lose weight, you might want to delay breakfast a bit, do some exercise in the morning. You'll preferentially burn some fat and eat in an 8-hour window. By eating in an 8 or a 10-hour window, what you end up doing is reduce some of the late night eating that tends to convert to fat. You're limiting some of the eating that's not because you're hungry, but because you're bored or tired or angry or whatever. And, sleep when you're tired and eat when you're hungry and, make sure you're getting some exercise. And then what ends up happening is it's easier to regulate weight. Now, you still want to eat a whole plant food diet because if you're eating refined sugars, your insulin's going to go up, your sugar goes down, you're going to get cravings and binging, and you're going to have constantly fighting your biology. Whereas when you eat a whole plant food diet or a plant food diet that includes animal products, your blood sugars are going to be much more stable. And so you're going to have less of the binging and the craving and the problems, and it's not going to seem so overwhelming getting your nutrition in a relatively narrow window. That gives you fasting of 12 to 16 hours every day. And that 12 to 16 hours of fasting is thought to induce some biochemical changes cumulatively, day after day, after week, after month, that are thought to be very beneficial. Walter Longo and his group have done a lot of work on intermittent fasting, and they have products out there that they advocate that people can do. What we do at TrueNorth Health is a little different. It's medically supervised long-term water-only fasting. It has a geometric impact on these biomarker changes. But the downside is it does require, first of all, you have to make sure you're a good candidate for fasting. That's a medical history exam lab. You need to monitor yourself during fasting. You need to carefully refeed after fasting to avoid refeeding syndrome, which can be a very serious problem, or dehydration or other problems. So long-term fasting that we're talking about is done in conjunction with your doctor or at a facility that specializes in long-term fasting. The short-term intermittent fasting, almost everybody can do without a problem because it doesn't require modification of medications. It doesn't require you to change anything other than some bad habits.
Yeah. Yeah. What about for females? I have heard recently a lot of talk that for females, they shouldn't fast as long, maybe just a 12-hour fast versus 16-hour. Have you seen any of that?
Well, whether it's male or female, the duration of their fasting wouldn't determine by their sex. It would be determined by their, what their goals are. Again, if you're trying to lose weight, then usually a narrower feeding window. If you're trying to gain weight, or if you're an athlete and burning a lot of calories, you may not have enough hours in the day if you're only eating in an 8-hour window. This is low caloric density food, high nutrient density food, but you need more volume than you would if you're eating more concentrated foods. So whether you're a male or a female, the real important thing is do you have enough hours in the day to get enough total calories in to meet your needs? For people losing weight, it's not as big of an issue, but for an athlete, a young person, or a person that's doing hard manual labor, maybe burning 3,500 calories a day, you got to get enough total food into the feeding bag in order to meet your needs. You asked me earlier what I eat. My pattern of eating is very simple. I have 3 meals a day during an 8-hour window. Usually the morning meal is a little bit lighter. It's more fruit, greens, maybe a little oatmeal, something like that. At lunch and dinner, I have large vegetable salads, large amounts of steamed vegetables, and some kind of complex carbohydrate, beans, rice, depending on the day and whatever. But it's all going to be whole plant foods. No meat, fish, fowl, eggs, dairy products, no oil, salt, no sugar. So just whole foods, a variety of them, and enough volume to meet the 2,500 calories that I need. I don't need as much calories as may somebody else that's doing a different kind of work. My work is relatively passive. My athleticism is I play basketball 4 times a week, so there's some aerobic calorie burning there, but I don't need a huge, and I'm old, I'm 65 years old. You don't burn as many calories as you do when you're, if you're carrying large amounts of muscle mass and whatever. So somebody else might not be able to follow the same pattern just because they're going to need more hours because they're going to need more calories. For me, no problem eating in an 8-hour window.
Got it. Yeah. And it sounds like, I'm curious, what's your opinion on protein? Assuming it comes from a decent source, not a McDonald's, burger or something like that. Because it sounds like yours is sort of a low protein diet from what you said. It's not very high protein, just basically salads or fruits, right?
Well, no, it's kind of, you're going to get 10% of your calories from protein. I don't care who you are. If you're an athlete and you're burning 3,500 calories, you get more protein because you get more calories. If you're a pregnant woman, you get more protein because you get more calories. You don't need a higher concentration of protein per calorie. So it's not like, an athlete needs 15% of their calories from protein. No, an athlete and a pregnant woman and an older person and a younger person need around 10% of their calories. What varies is their calories. Your calories may vary by 50% or 100% even in some cases, depending on your load. And so to get 10% of your calories from protein is virtually impossible not to get 10% of your calories from protein unless you're eating refined carbohydrates and alcohol and sugar and all this kind of stuff. So if you're eating whole plant foods, you're going to get about 10% of your calories from protein. The danger with protein is too much protein. Too much protein is actually a major health risk factor. For example, much of the kidney disease you see is because of excess protein, particularly excess animal protein, which is very high in sulfur amino acids. Much of the osteoporosis you see is contributed to by excess protein intake. Much of the cardiovascular disease, in fact, excess animal protein may be a bigger risk factor than excess animal fat when it comes to cardiovascular disease and certainly cancer. So excess animal protein, excess protein in general, major health risk factor. So the challenge is how can you get the protein level down to what you actually need, which is, in that 40 to 60 to 70 grams a day for most people, not 120 grams, 150 grams. Munich brewery workers, which were the people that they originally did to determine average protein intake, had an average of 120 grams of protein a day. But they also died in their 40s from cardiovascular disease. So they really weren't the best model to determine what good protein intake. There's a pretty good consensus if you look at any standard nutrition text today. I'm not necessarily talking about any advocate on the internet, but if you go to Shills and Young or any standard nutrition, they're going to tell you just exactly what I told you. Around 10% of calories from protein, and from whole foods, you'll get the essential amino acids as well as the total quantity and quality of protein that you need to maintain optimum health. More protein, more risk factors as far as health is concerned.
Very interesting. Yeah, it's great to hear these different perspectives because we hear other people who are just like, your whole diet should be based around protein and you got to hit your protein number.
The reason they say that is they're trying to get the fasting mimicking effect of a ketogenic diet. When you're in fasting, there's virtually no hunger because of the effect of a high-fat intake in eliminating carbohydrates sends you into ketosis, so you have a hunger blunting effect. Well, that's great for short term. But you don't put a person on a water-only fast forever, and you don't put a person, hopefully, on a high-protein, high-fat diet forever. Because, yes, it'll blunt your hunger mechanisms. Yes, it may facilitate short-term weight loss. But you're not just worried about short-term weight loss, you're worried about long-term health. And to put a person on a high animal protein, high animal fat diet long-term, we know what happens. You'll start seeing the data coming out now as people start extending the period of time that they do that. They get some big benefits initially from weight loss, blood sugar control, etc., but they have the problems with gallbladder, colon, and cancer long term. And so it takes a while for that to show up before people realize, oh yeah, maybe that wasn't such a great idea. So again, short-term benefit versus long-term health. We gotta keep all that in perspective. And honestly, any diet you do that gets rid of refined carbohydrates, whether it's the dead Dr. Atkins diet, whatever you do, you're going to get benefit, because there's almost nothing you can do that's worse than the standard American diet in terms of it does everything wrong and almost nothing right. So even if you're doing things that maybe I disagree with, too much animal protein, too much animal fat, it's still better than what they were doing with eating as much animal food as they could, plus the refined carbohydrates. I mean, let's face it, people going on a keto diet, they were already eating animal food 3 times a day. How much more animal food do you think they're going to eat? What they did was they got rid of the refined carbohydrates, and maybe they even threw a few vegetables in, just a little bit of,
Yeah. It's really, this is great. I love hearing different perspectives, and then the listeners can kind of, decide for themselves based on different things that they hear. Most people are saying 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight or close to it, so it's very, very interesting.
Usually that's coming from athletic trainers. They're talking about what's the best amount of protein to get the most muscle in the quickest time.
Right.
And and that may very well be true. I'm not arguing that short-term athletic performance might be a different model. I'm really talking about long-term health. That's it.
Makes a lot of sense. And when you think about it too, you typically don't think about someone who's a centenarian living to over 100 years old, and they're some like big muscular person, right? Like they're typically like, usually you see the taller, bigger people are not, you think of it someone who is lighter, right? And so, yeah, I think as you get older, maybe focusing on different things, especially as you get older, could make a lot of sense.
Well, the endurance athletes really don't have much of a problem with this, because they know that these diets are consistent with long-term endurance performance. So, you don't find endurance athletes arguing, oh no, you have to have a gram of protein per pound and all that kind of stuff, because they understand that. It's mostly people trying to increase muscle mass, the most. And that's where a lot of that motivation is. And I understand that, people want to, but listen, one of the reasons why animals products work so well for short-term muscle gain is partly the hormone carryover. We give the animals these steroids and hormones in order to help them get bigger and fatter and faster and be more marketable. And that carries over to us, including to our little girls. When we feed little girls cow milk, they will, think about the average age of menstruation, how it's changed from 15 down to as little as 9 and 10 in some cases, because we're giving our girls the sex hormones that make them become sexually mature much quicker, and that increase their lifetime risk of breast cancer, do all kinds of nasty things, not to mention the acne and all the other stuff that goes along with it. But if you don't do that and you're a school district, you lose your federal funding, because we've allowed the dairy industry to become using the classroom as a marketing campaign, and influence us with government regulations that really don't make any good long-term sense at all. But people really believe that because they've been really integrated that everybody needs milk, when in reality it may be one of the most harmful substances that we're putting into people. You don't see type 1 diabetics at the same proportion in cultures that don't feed their kids cow's milk. I think even the American Pediatric Association warns about, cow milk in the first 2 years, unless it's processed to remove the proteins because of the stimulation of type 1 diabetics. That's one of the things that happens in vulnerable kids that are given cow milk. The immune system reacts, takes out the islets of Langerhans in the pancreas. That's what type 1 diabetes is. There's also viruses that can do that. But so the point is, things that we're trying to do the right thing can really backfire on us. It's interesting looking at, So, big arguments for large amounts of animal food, maybe not always scientifically based though.
Yeah, I think that, we actually had some people. So let's give people an alternative. Let's get back to fasting, because I want to give people the alternative and talk about some different ways to do it and how you supervise it. And you have a book that I think just came out called called Can
Yeah.
Fasting Save Your Life, which I think is a great title. And so, because we did have someone recently on the podcast who made a really good case for that. He had something called a satiety index per calorie, and he talked about how protein is the most satiating, and therefore your
Yes.
diet should be based around protein, because then you'll be satiated. You won't always be hungry. Obviously, the key point there that you agree with is you're eliminating the processed carbs and not on a super high carbohydrate, with processed food type of diet there. But what's an alternative then to that? Because this is really a mainstream kind of thinking right now,
Right.
that, hey, protein will keep you satiated, you won't be hungry, you'll lose weight, those kind of things. But
Right.
you're bringing a different approach. So let's talk about the fasting.
Well, it's true that, again, anything that gets rid of refined carbohydrates will help with satiety. But the most satiating food of all are low caloric density, high nutrient density foods. And the best example of that are vegetables, both salad and steamed vegetables. You can eat 100 calories a pound on salad. So, I mean, literally, you cannot get obese eating salad. You'd have to start at 6 a.m., never stop eating till midnight. You'd still only get about 20 pounds in. It'd be 2,000 calories. You're losing weight. So there's lots of vitamins, mineral, fiber, and water, not a lot of caloric density. Steamed vegetables, a little bit more concentrated because you heat process them, 200 calories a pound. You'd have to have 10 pounds a day of steamed vegetables. And again, you just can't eat that, which means if you fill yourself up with lots of salad, lots of steamed vegetables, you're going to have less room in order to put in the more concentrated foods, which is what we do, salad, steamed vegetables. And then you're using potatoes, rice, and beans. These have 500 calories a pound. Well, you only need 4 or 5 pounds a day to meet your needs. So, I mean, they're more appealing to the brain than, say, salad at 100 calories a pound. But you're not getting overweight on them. It's not a cause of problems. People eating large volumes of fruit, salad, steamed vegetables, starchy vegetables tend to be leaner and meaner. They get about 10% of their calories from protein. They get their nutrient needs met. And they do not have blood sugar vacillation problems. They do not have satiety problems because you're eating a lot of food. So yes, animal foods are more satiating because when people think carbohydrate, they think breads, crackers, refined carbohydrates. 86% of all carbohydrates are refined carbohydrates. They're not thinking potatoes, or if they're thinking potatoes, they're thinking French fries and potato chips. Potatoes have 500 calories a pound. Potato chips and French fries, 2,500 calories a pound. 5 times the caloric density because you use them as a sponge to soak up the grease. So if you really understand the reason people are in trouble is 93% of calories have nothing to do with whole foods. People aren't thinking when they think, oh, let's go on a 80% of calorie diet carbohydrates. They're not thinking salads and steamed vegetables and stuff like that. They're thinking pizzas and processed food products.
Makes sense.
We agree on all of that. The only question is how much animal food or how much protein is a reasonable amount to maintain health. I think there's a pretty good literature on that. And so 10% of calories from protein, 15 to 18% of calories of fat, the balance coming from complex carbohydrates. That's how you're designed. That's what human beings did for the vast majority of human history. You know, animal foods were always used, but they were used as celebratory foods. They weren't the basis of the diet, except for some very rare cultures who actually did not live very long. You know, the Alaskans and others that had very high fat, high protein diets, you know, were very strong people, but they were dying in their 40s from cardiovascular disease. So long-lived people typically were on lower amounts of animal foods, high amounts of whole plant foods, and were very active.
Makes sense. So yeah, let's talk about your book, Can Fasting Save Your Life? And what are some of the things that people can expect if they buy that book? Or who are some of the people, because there are people listening now, should everyone do a 5-day water fast once a year? I've heard of people, and I've done this a few times myself, is like I'll do a 24-hour fast from Saturday night to Sunday night, which I recently stopped doing because I didn't want to miss out on the protein intake that everyone told me I need to get. Right. What's a good protocol for, let's just say, a normal person? Maybe they're 20 pounds overweight or average. What's a good kind of rule of thumb?
So what they should do, I think, is fast every day for 12 to 16 hours. Don't eat 3 to 4 hours before you go to bed. And then eat large quantities of low-density foods like salads and fruits and whole plant foods. And if you're going to eat more concentrated foods, the less the better. And if you're a male, you should be expecting to lose 2 to 3 pounds a week on this type of a diet down to optimum weight. If you're a female, it's going to be about 50% less. It's about 2 pounds a week because women are full of estrogen, which is a fat storage hormone. So they're much more energy-conserving fat storage devices, biologically speaking. Males are full of testosterone, which is essentially a fat burning hormone. So, if you're a male, it's going to happen a little bit easier. If you're a female, you're going to have to work a lot harder at it. But bottom line is the same diet's going to work well for both. With fasting, if you fast every day, you're essentially getting 365 12 to 16-hour fasts in every year. And then, perhaps a longer fast might have some utility, particularly for people that have health-related challenges. And that's where this book is useful. Can fasting save your life? Because it'll help you determine, one, are you a candidate for fasting? Number two, if you are going to fast, what decisions do you want to make in terms of monitoring, rest, and what are your expectations? What are the changes we see? How does high blood pressure, how does diabetes, how does autoimmune disease, how does cancer respond to fasting? But it not only gives you the information you need to know, am I a candidate and how am I going to do it? But it also gives you the information your doctor needs to know to help you. Because if you're going to do long-term fasting, in order to determine if you're a good candidate, you do need to make sure you've had an exam in some lab, because you don't want to fast people that are poor candidates for fasting. If you're on medications, you do not fast on medications. And
Right.
so you have to determine, is it safe for me to wean or withhold medication or not? If you can't withhold the medication, you need to modify the program so that you don't burn a hole in your stomach, shut your liver or kidneys down, or create a problem. And this book gives you and your doctor the information you need so you can rationally and intelligently evaluate the literature that's out there on fasting. Now, we've published 22 papers in the scientific literature. Those are certainly represented there. There's other people like Walter Long who have been publishing a lot of work on intermittent fasting and animal-based studies as well. And we've taken much of that information, incorporated into a book that's written by myself and Dr. Tasha Myers. Dr. Myers is our director of research, and she's a PhD from Columbia that is brilliant, but she writes in a way that people can actually understand what she's talking about. So it's taking a complex situation, but making it accessible. And that's one of the, I think, the strengths of Can Fasting Save Your Life, is it's useful both to you, and it's also credible enough and scientifically based for your doctor to realize there's something to this that can be implemented.
Yeah. Yeah. So what about, let's just say, when is a good time? So we talked about intermittent fasting and doing that every day. What about for some people who have a hard time doing that? If, let's say I have a hard time fasting for 16 hours. After 12 hours, I start getting hungry. I want to go to the gym, but now I don't feel like I can do it because I'm still a little hungry. I just want a little something. What advice do you give to people who are having a hard time doing it?
Well, if you're hungry, it's often because your blood sugar levels aren't stable enough yet. And that's because it's too quick to when you've been eating refined carbohydrates and all the rest of it. Eventually your blood sugars are going to get stable. Or even if you skip a meal, it's not going to be a problem. And going to the gym and working out before you eat actually may have an advantage. Some people believe that exercising after a 12-hour fast preferentially mobilizes fat. So for those people at least interested in mobilizing fat reserves, that might actually be an advantage. I know I play basketball at 5:30 in the morning, and I don't eat breakfast, whether I'm exercising or not, until 8 or 8:30. I find it works great exercising on an empty stomach. And, blood sugars have stabilized over the years. You get used to doing that. I don't see it as a problem for interfering with your exercise. The bigger challenge is people want to keep eating at night because they're bored, tired, angry, or frustrated. And so not eating 3 to 4 hours before to bed is excellent advice, but it's harder to do for people that like to sit and watch TV and eat. In fact, males in our society, I find they're doing less and less exercise. They've actually started hiring other people to exercise for them. And it's called the NFL. And so what they do is they sit in overstuffed chairs drinking high caloric beverages, watching other males engage in mock warfare, pretending to be part of the winning coalition.
Right, right. What about longer term fast then? So we talked about intermittent fasting.
Yes.
Should it be part of a normal protocol to do a 24-hour fast once a month, once a week? What do you think?
I don't think so. I think there's good evidence on the 16 hours. The problem is between 16 hours and 48 hours is the most biologically expensive part of fasting. That's where you're still burning some higher protein levels. Your body hasn't converted into the fasting state. So doing a couple days of fasting, like 10 two-day fast, is not like doing a 20-day fast. So I think if you need to do a longer fast, either preventatively because you want to fast for a week, and or you have blood pressure, you have a health reason you're trying to overcome, you have to do 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks of fasting. That needs to be done in a resting state in appropriately screened patients with appropriate monitoring. Whether you do it at home and you use your local doctor and our telemedicine doctors to support you, or you come to the TrueNorth Health Center and you fast in a controlled setting, it doesn't change how the fast has to be. Proper history, exam, and lab to make sure you're a good candidate, to have markers you can use to reliably monitor it, monitor the fast appropriately, rest, and then be very careful to refeed. It takes half the length of the fast of controlled refeeding. So a 20-day fast takes 10 days of controlled refeeding in order to be able to avoid refeeding syndrome and all the problems that people talk about with fasting. There's a reason we've had 40 years and 25,000 people successfully come in and come out with no mortality. It's because we follow this protocol, the protocol that's laid out in our book. Again, you can do it at home if you rest, but you still got to do it following the protocol if you want to be safe.
Right. Right. And so just wrapping up as well, so you mentioned people with autoimmune, people who may have cancer, right? It seems to me like someone who has one of these major health issues like cancer, like an autoimmune, just doing a full elimination like this can be huge, right? Because a lot of times you don't even know what it is. So you just eliminate everything and you're going to clear it out.
It's startling how effective doing nothing intelligently is. So about 80% of our type 2 diabetics will achieve normal blood sugar without any medication. Virtually every essential hypertensive patient normalizes their blood pressure without medication. And if they're willing to do the diet, they can sustain it. Autoimmune diseases, plaque psoriasis, rheumatoid arthritis, ulcerative colitis, ankylosing spondylitis, asthma, eczema, these conditions that people think are hopeless respond well enough that people not only can manage the condition, but they can get off the steroids and all the long-term consequential drugs, which cause such devastating effects. And at least some forms of cancer, like lymphoma, we've shown not only short-term, but 3 or 10-year follow-up. Good data. We published in the British Medical Journal. We have a new case series which shows these results are not just isolated or, somebody got lucky, but these are reproducible events in certain types of conditions like lymphoma. Now we're treating a lot of long COVID and vaccine-injured patients that have activation of underlying autoimmune disease and other problems secondary to their experience or lack of resolution of COVID. These patients are also responding. In fact, we just published a paper, 2-year long COVID nightmare with the brain fog and the fatigue and all the rest of it. Great outcome, 2 weeks of fasting, good long-term follow-up data. So again, if you want to see the outcome, read this book because it's built on those case reports. It's built on those studies. Or go to our website at TrueNorthHealth.com, and you can see all of the articles freely available. You can download them. You can read them yourself. You can see what the results are. All of this information is really straightforward. That's just really hard to do because we're addicts and we're living in a world that's not supportive of people living healthily right now.
Yeah. Well, this has been really eye-opening. I'm really happy we had this conversation. Dr. Goldhamer, where can people follow you, learn more, buy the book?
Sure. Well, one thing we offer is a free phone conversation with me. If your listeners are interested in knowing, is this something that might be relevant to them? All they have to do is go to our website, again, TrueNorthHealth.com, fill out the registration forms. It gives me your medical history. I'll review that with you, and we can talk about, are you a candidate for fasting? What kind of fasting duration should you be thinking about? Who around you, maybe closer by, might be able to help you, or maybe one of our telemedicine people can help you remotely, or maybe you want to come to the center or one of the other places that does fasting supervision. We can do that. There's no cost for that screening type of a call. And so, lots of ways we can try to help you. We have a Roku channel that's free. All the videos free. We have live streaming, the educational classes we teach at our center. You can go to our website and you can access those. None of our stuff is monetized. And so, lots of opportunity for you to get good content without having to spend any money.
Amazing. Amazing. Well, thank you so much for sharing this. I highly encourage people, especially people who have a medical condition or someone close to them has a medical condition. I highly encourage them to take you up on that offer and reach out to you. And thank you so much for everything you're doing and all the 20,000+ people that you've helped over the years. It's truly incredible what you've done, and we can't thank you enough for your service.
Well, thanks for getting the word out.
Thank you. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, can you please leave us a rating or review and subscribe? I've realized that while we have actually increased our downloads a lot, we're actually getting a lot of downloads, which I'm really happy about. We actually have very few ratings. And I realized that I've never asked people really to rate much. So I'm asking you now if you could please rate and review and subscribe. And if you enjoyed the episode, please forward it along to anyone that you think will get value out of this. Also, if you haven't checked out our line of products at buypeakperformance.com, you get 20% off your first order. That's www.buypeakperformance.com. We have some incredible products, including our organic high-altitude coffee. If you don't know this, coffee is one of the most heavily sprayed with pesticides out of any crop. So it's really important that you drink organic coffee. We've gone above and beyond to source what we believe is the highest quality and healthiest organic coffee in the world. We're also famous for our organic green superfood powder. You can get 20% off of that as well at buypeakperformance.com. We also have an organic vegan and paleo plant protein. See, most of the vegan proteins out there are using brown rice protein, which is really not a good source of protein, and it's also a grain. And if you're paleo, you know that grains tend to cause inflammation in some cases for some people. And so we wanted to make one that was paleo friendly and vegan and organic. We made an amazing amino acid profile, so it's really one of the best plant proteins for muscle building. So you can check out Peak Performance Organic Plant Protein. You can find that on our website. Of course, all our products are on Amazon as well. So thanks again. And again, please, if you enjoyed the episode, please forward it along to someone who you feel can get value out of it. And please leave us a rating, review, and subscribe. Thank you.